On the morning of January 23rd, 1909, a ship worth over $2 million left New York Harbor, carrying more wealth than some nations possessed. Her name was Republic. White Star Line. 465 feet of steel and luxury. Twin funnels, watertight compartments, first-class suites with mahogany paneling and private baths, millionaires who controlled banks, women in pearls worth lifetimes of wages. They paid $300 for a ticket, and they paid for certainty. 48 hours later, she was gone. Torn open in fog, every passenger survived. But within weeks, the rumors began. Sealed manifests, classified treasury records, salvagers who reached the wreck and never returned, divers who saw things they won't explain. A safe still locked, 260 feet down. We're going to cover everything. Who built her, who sailed her, what she carried, how she sank, and what still lies in the dark. The dark story of the Millionaires Ship, RMS Republic. So here's the question. Was the rescue the miracle? Or was it the cover story? Republic was built in Belfast, Holland and Wolff, the same yard that would later build Titanic. She was launched in 1903 for the White Star Line, a company that understood luxury was not decoration, it was architecture. She was 465 feet long, 52 feet across the beam, 15,000 tons displacement, twin screws, twin masts, twin funnels painted in White Star's trademark buff and black. She could carry 2,000 souls, though she rarely did. Her purpose was not volume, it was prestige. She ran the Mediterranean service mostly. New York to the Azores, to Gibraltar, to Genoa, to Naples, to Alexandria. The route of the wealthy in winter. Those escaping the cold, chasing the sun, visiting the continent for culture or health or simple boredom. Republic was their conveyance, and White Star designed her accordingly. First class occupied the entire center of the ship. 3 decks, amidships, where the motion was least, and the noise from engines barely noticeable. The public rooms were arranged in the Edwardian style, meaning restraint was the ultimate display. No gilding for its own sake, no excess, just material so fine and craftsmanship so careful that the cost became implicit. The dining saloon seated 300. It ran the full width of the ship, lit by skylights inlaid with frosted glass, surrounded by columns of carved oak. The chairs were upholstered in crimson velvet imported from Lyon. Each table setting included 6 pieces of silverware, 3 glasses, and a small card listing the menu in French and English. Dinner was served at 8, 7 courses. White-gloved stewards moved in silence. The carpet was so thick you couldn't hear footsteps. Adjacent to the dining saloon was the smoking room. Leather armchairs, mahogany paneling, a working fireplace, which seems absurd on a ship, but was considered essential. The fire was gas, regulated, safe. It crackled convincingly. The walls were lined with bookshelves, mostly for show, though some passengers did read. Others played cards, poker, bridge, whist. Small fortunes changed hands over bourbon and cigars. The ceiling was coffered, painted cream, detailed with gold leaf at the edges. One observer noted that sitting in that room felt less like being at sea and more like being in a London club that happened to sway gently. The music room was smaller, more intimate. A Steinway grand piano stood near the windows, which were enormous, stretching nearly floor to ceiling, offering views of the ocean that passengers described as hypnotic. The furniture here was wicker and cane, lighter, more feminine. This was where women gathered in the afternoons while men smoked. Tea was served at 4. Scones, jam, thin sandwiches with the crusts removed. A stewardess in uniform poured from silver pots. Conversations were quiet. Gossip, charity work, fashion, health. Outside the windows, the sea rolled past, indifferent. Then there was the Veranda Cafe. Republic was one of the first liners to feature this. A glassed-in promenade deck at the stern, fitted with white wicker chairs and potted palms, designed to mimic the feel of a Mediterranean resort. Passengers could sit there in the morning with coffee and newspapers, shielded from wind but still surrounded by light and air. It was popular. On warm days, the glass panels were slid open. On cold days, they stayed shut, and the space became a greenhouse. The palms thrived. So did the passengers. The staterooms were not enormous, but they were complete. First-class cabins ranged from single-occupancy inside rooms to two-room suites with private bathrooms. Bathrooms were still rare at sea in 1909. Most ships, even in first class, had shared facilities down the corridor. But Republic offered select suites with full baths, porcelain tubs, sinks with hot and cold running water, brass fixtures polished daily. The suites also had sitting areas with sofas, writing desks, wardrobes large enough for steamer trunks to be unpacked entirely. Bedding was linen. Blankets were wool. Pillows were down. Everything was changed while passengers were at breakfast. Second class, by contrast, was comfortable but plain. Smaller cabins, shared washrooms, a modest dining room with long communal tables. The food was good, the service competent, but there was no pretense. These were middle managers, clerks, teachers, shopkeepers traveling for business or family. They paid a third of what first class paid and received a third of the attention. Still, it was far better than third class, which was tucked low in the hull. Narrow bunks, dim lighting, minimal ventilation. Third-class passengers were emigrants, mostly. Italians, Greeks, Syrians, Jews from the Pale. People moving towards something, or fleeing something, or both. They ate stew and bread. They slept 4 or 6 to a cabin. The ship's designers gave them little thought beyond meeting the legal minimum. Republic's engines were triple expansion steam reciprocating. 2 of them driving twin screws. They burned coal, approximately 240 tons per day at cruising speed. The coal was loaded by hand in New York, shoveled into bunkers that ran along both sides of the hull, below the waterline. The stokers worked in shifts, 6 hours on, 6 off, feeding the furnaces. The heat down there was brutal. Over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men stripped to the waist, skin slick with sweat and coal dust, shoveling ton after ton into mouths of fire. It was hard labor, dangerous labor. Boilers occasionally burst. Men were scalded, crushed, or simply worked to exhaustion. They were paid $30 a month. The crew totaled 400. That included deck officers, engineers, stewards, stewardesses, cooks, bakers, butchers, scullery workers, laundry staff, coal trimmers, firemen, able seamen, carpenters, and a small medical team. The captain was William Inman Sealby, 52 years old, 30 years at sea, 15 with White Star. He was a company man, reliable, not flashy. He knew the Mediterranean route well. He had made this crossing dozens of times. Republic, for him, was routine. The ship's design included 10 watertight compartments separated by steel bulkheads. These could be closed manually, or from the bridge using electric switches. The theory was that Republic could survive flooding in any 2 compartments and still float. This was considered advanced. Most ships of her era had fewer compartments, or compartments that didn't extend high enough to prevent water from spilling over the top. Republic's compartments went up to E-deck, well above the waterline under normal conditions. The designers were confident. So was White Star. They advertised the ship as unsinkable. Not in those words exactly, but the implication was clear. Modern, safe, secure. But ships are not buildings. They move. They flex. They encounter forces that architects never consider. Ice, waves, other ships, human error. And the sea, which has no opinion about engineering, only physics. Republic departed New York on the afternoon of January 22, 1909. Pier 59, in the Hudson. It was cold. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-30s. The dock was crowded. Passengers, porters, stevedores, well-wishers. Steamer trunks were loaded by crane, swung aboard in nets, lowered into holds. First-class passengers boarded via a wide gangway amidships, greeted by officers in uniform. Second and third class used separate gangways farther aft. There was no mingling. The classes were separated from the moment they stepped aboard. Among the first-class passengers that day were names that appeared regularly in the society pages. There was Captain John Grant, United States Army retired, traveling with his wife. There was Mrs. Eugenia Hinchcliffe, widow of a railroad executive, returning to England. There was Colonel Eugene Fitch Ware, lawyer, poet, former pension commissioner under President Harrison. There was Charles Herbert Lightoller, though not the Titanic officer. This was a financier, no relation, traveling with his family. There was J.P. Morgan's niece, though her name was kept quiet. Morgan himself wasn't aboard, but his shadow was. He was a major shareholder in the International Mercantile Marine, which owned White Star. His money had paid for ships like Republic. His preferences shaped their design. The wealthiest man aboard, by most accounts, was George W. Burleigh. Shipping magnate, owner of coastal steamers, warehouses, terminals. His net worth was estimated at over $4 million, which in 1909 was the equivalent of roughly $120 million today. He was traveling to Italy to finalize a deal involving Mediterranean freight contracts. His wife accompanied him. So did his secretary. They occupied a suite on B deck with a private bath and sitting room. The suite cost $300 one way. A coal stoker made $30 a month. There were others: investment bankers, attorneys, industrialists, a concert violinist, a countess, minor Bavarian nobility, a doctor specializing in tuberculosis heading to a sanatorium in Switzerland, a playwright whose name is now forgotten, but who was then enjoying moderate success on Broadway. These were people accustomed to comfort, to being seen, to moving through the world with the assumption that systems would work in their favor. They boarded Republic expecting a pleasant 6 days at sea. Calm waters, good food, interesting conversation, perhaps a little gambling, perhaps a little romance. The Mediterranean awaited. Second class was quieter. Families, a few honeymooners, businessmen traveling alone, a priest, a school teacher, people with modest means but enough to afford better than steerage. They admired the ship as they boarded, peering into the first-class areas through glass doors they were not permitted to open. Some resented the division. Others accepted it. That was simply how things were. Third class, as always, was chaos. Families with children, elderly relatives, young men traveling solo. They spoke Italian, Greek, Yiddish, Arabic. Most had never been on a ship this large. Some had never been on a ship at all. They carried bundles, suitcases tied with rope, cloth sacks. Their belongings smelled of home: spices, soap, smoke. The crew hurried them along. Inspections for lice and disease were cursory. Documents were checked, tickets stamped. They descended steep staircases into the lower decks, into compartments that smelled of paint and coal and salt. Bunks were assigned. Baggage stowed. Children cried. The stewards barked instructions in English, which most didn't understand. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was the price of passage. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Republic's moorings were cast off. Tugs nudged her away from the pier. Her whistle sounded, deep and resonant, echoing off the buildings along the waterfront. On deck, passengers waved to people they couldn't really see. On the pier, people waved back. The gap widened. 10 feet, 20, 50. The tugs pulled her into the current. She turned slowly, her bow pointing south, down the Hudson toward the Narrows. Her engines engaged. The screws bit the water. She began to move under her own power. The city slid past. Warehouses, shipyards. The Statue of Liberty, green and massive, holding her torch against the winter sky. Passengers crowded the rails to see her. Even the wealthy, who had seen her dozens of times, paused. There was something about leaving land, something final. The ship passed through the Narrows, into lower New York Bay, then out past Sandy Hook. The land fell away. The horizon opened. By 6 in the evening, Republic was alone on the Atlantic, 14 knots, heading east-southeast. Dinner that first night was formal. The dining saloon filled at 8. Men in tailcoats, women in gowns. Jewelry glittered under the electric lights. The menu included oysters, consommé, roast lamb, potatoes dauphinoise, asparagus with hollandaise, a cheese course, and dessert. 3 options, including a chocolate soufflé that passengers particularly praised. Wine was served, French mostly, white with the fish course, red with the lamb. Champagne for those who wanted it. Conversation was light. Introductions were made. People discussed their plans. Italy, Egypt, the Riviera, health, investments, the season's theater. No one mentioned risk. No one mentioned the sea. It was just there, outside the windows, dark and vast, rolling under the hull. After dinner, some retired to the smoking room. Cards were dealt. Cigars were lit. Others went to the music room, where a passenger, an amateur but skilled, played Chopin on the Steinway. A small crowd gathered. Women in chairs, men standing near the windows. The music was delicate, precise. Outside, the ocean was invisible, just blackness pressing against the glass. The ship moved forward. The engines hummed. The night passed. Below, in second class, the priest led a rosary. In third class, families bedded down early. Children were tucked into narrow bunks. The deck lights were dimmed. Stewards made their rounds. Captain Sealby remained on the bridge until 10, then retired to his cabin, leaving the night watch to his officers. The sea was calm. Visibility good. No weather warnings. The ship followed her planned course, staying well offshore, away from coastal traffic. By midnight, most of Republic was asleep. The rich in their suites, the middling in their cabins, the poor in their bunks. The stokers shoveled. The engineers monitored gauges. The lookouts stood on the bow, scanning the horizon. The ship breathed. Steam hissed. Water rushed past the hull. Somewhere far below, fish moved in darkness. Above, stars appeared between scattered clouds. The air was cold. The Atlantic in January is never warm, but the ship was heated. Radiators in the cabins, steam lines running through the walls. Passengers slept under wool blankets, insulated from the night, comfortable, safe, unaware that 200 miles ahead, another ship was moving toward them through the same dark water. Her name was Florida. Italian registry, smaller than Republic. Older. A cargo steamer, southbound from Portland, Maine, loaded with coal and iron ore. She had left port 2 days earlier. Her engines were slower, her crew less experienced, her equipment less modern. She had no wireless. Her navigation was done by compass, sextant, and dead reckoning. Her lookout had only his eyes. And on the night of January 23rd, 1909, the weather changed. Fog rolled in from the north. Dense, cold. The kind that forms when warm air moves over freezing water. It reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. Florida's captain ordered the ship's bell rung continuously, as regulations required. He slowed the engines, but he did not stop. Stopping meant losing steerage, drifting, becoming even more vulnerable. So he continued, at reduced speed, ringing the bell, hoping any ship nearby would hear and steer clear. He had no way to know that Republic, moving at 14 knots, was less than 3 miles away, closing fast, also enveloped in fog, also ringing her bell, also hoping. At 4:47 in the morning, Republic's lookout heard something. A bell. Faint. Off the starboard bow. He shouted to the bridge. The officer on watch, Third Officer Bertrand, ordered the helm hard to port. The ship began to turn. Too slowly. 30 seconds later, out of the fog, a dark shape appeared. Low, black. Florida's bow, moving at an angle. Bertrand shouted for full reverse. The engine room responded, but there was no time. Physics had already decided. Florida struck Republic on the starboard side, just aft of amidships, below the waterline. Her bow was reinforced for ice. It punched through Republic's steel plating like a fist through wet paper. The sound was catastrophic. Metal screaming, rivets popping, a noise so loud it woke passengers on the far side of the ship. The impact drove Florida's bow nearly 10 feet into Republic's hull, piercing the number 5 compartment, tearing open fuel bunkers, rupturing steam lines. Water and coal dust exploded inward. The lights flickered. Alarms rang. And in the first-class cabins, directly above the wound, passengers were thrown from their beds. The first sound most passengers heard was not the collision itself, but the silence that followed. The engines stopped. Republic's great triple expansion steam plant, which had hummed constantly since departure, went quiet. That absence of sound was wrong. Passengers who had been asleep sat up in darkness. The electric lights had cut out immediately. Emergency oil lamps flickered on in the corridors, casting yellow shadows that moved with the ship's motion. And the ship was moving differently now, listing. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that objects on nightstands began to slide. Water glasses tipped. Pocket watches skittered across polished wood. In Suite B42, George Burley lit a candle and opened his door. The corridor was filling with people in nightclothes. Stewards moved among them, voices calm but urgent, instructing passengers to dress warmly and retrieve their life preservers. Burley asked what had happened. The steward didn't know. Or wouldn't say. Just, dress warmly, sir. Bring your life preserver. Proceed to the boat deck. Burley closed the door. His wife was already awake, sitting up in bed, her face pale in the candlelight. He told her to get dressed. She asked if they were sinking. He said he didn't know, but he had been on ships long enough to recognize that silence. The silence of a vessel that had stopped fighting the sea. Down in third class, the collision had been more violent. Passengers near the impact point were thrown against bulkheads. Steel walls buckled inward. In compartment 5, water was already pouring in, black and freezing, rushing through the tear in the hull with such force that it sounded like a waterfall. Families scrambled toward the exits. The staircases were narrow. There were too many people and not enough space. Children screamed. Mothers clutched infants. Men shoved forward, instinct overriding decency. The water rose fast. Knee-deep within 2 minutes. Waist-deep within 5. Some passengers couldn't reach the stairs in time. They climbed onto bunks. They pounded on locked doors that separated third class from second. Doors that were kept bolted per immigration regulations. Those regulations assumed order. They did not account for disaster. On the bridge, Captain Sealby had arrived within 90 seconds of impact. He was in uniform, fully awake, assessing. The officer on watch reported the collision. Unknown vessel, starboard side, below waterline. Sealby ordered the watertight doors closed. The switch was thrown. Below decks, heavy steel doors dropped into place, sealing the compartments. But the damage was already done. Compartment 5 was flooding. Worse, the collision had ruptured the bulkhead between 5 and 6. Water was spilling over, moving forward. Republic could survive 2 flooded compartments. But 3? 4? The mathematics became grim very quickly. Sealby sent men below to assess the damage. They returned within 10 minutes. The report was unambiguous. The hull was breached across a span of nearly 12 feet. The pumps were running, but they couldn't keep pace. Water was entering faster than it could be expelled. The stokehold in compartment 6 was already knee-deep. The fires were going out. Without fire, there was no steam. Without steam, there were no pumps, no lights, no power. The ship was dying from the inside. Sealby made his decision. He ordered the wireless operator, John Binns, to send a distress signal. CQD, the precursor to SOS, come quick danger. Binns sat down at his station and began transmitting. CQD, CQD, CQD. Republic. Position 4. 0 degrees. 3 minutes north, 69 degrees, 38 minutes west. Struck by unknown steamer. Sinking. Require immediate assistance. He sent it again. And again. The signal pulsed out into the darkness. 50 miles. 100. 200. Somewhere out there, other ships were listening. The nearest was Baltic, a White Star liner, westbound from Liverpool. She was 80 miles away. Her wireless operator picked up the distress call at 5:15 in the morning. He woke the captain. Baltic changed course immediately, turning south, pushing her engines to maximum. But 80 miles at 15 knots meant more than 5 hours. Sealby knew this. He did the math. Republic was settling, slowly but perceptibly. The bow was lower. The list to starboard had increased to 5 degrees. 5 hours might be too long. Other ships responded. Phoenicia, 90 miles north. La Lorraine, French liner, 60 miles southeast. City of Everett, small coastal freighter, 70 miles west. And Florida. Florida was still there, locked against Republic's hull. The collision had wedged her bow into the wound she had created. Her captain, Angelo Ruspini, had tried to reverse engines to pull free, but the two ships were tangled. Ruspini ordered his crew to prepare lifeboats. He could see Republic's lights flickering. He could see people gathering on her decks. He knew what was coming. On Republic's boat deck, stewards were organizing the evacuation. The ship carried lifeboats for everyone aboard, a lesson learned from prior disasters. 20 boats total, capacity for 2,000. But launching them in darkness, in fog, with the ship listing and passengers panicking, was not simple. The davits were mechanical, hand-cranked, requiring crew coordination. Each boat had to be swung out over the rail, lowered evenly, loaded carefully. Too many people and the boat would swamp. Too few and space was wasted. The officers shouted instructions. Women and children first. Remain calm. Put on your life preservers properly. Do not jump. The life preservers were cork, wrapped in canvas, designed to be tied around the torso. Many passengers had never worn one. They put them on backward, upside down, too loose. Stewards moved through the crowd, adjusting straps, demonstrating. The preservers smelled of mildew. They were bulky, uncomfortable, but they floated. In theory. In practice, if you hit the water from height, the impact could break your ribs or snap your neck. The officers knew this. They did not mention it. Mrs. Eugenia Hinchcliffe stood near Lifeboat 7, wrapped in a fur coat over her nightgown. She had retrieved her jewelry case from her cabin. Diamonds, emeralds, a necklace that had belonged to her mother. The case was small, leather, heavy. A steward told her she couldn't bring it. She refused to leave it. He told her again. She held it tighter. Finally, another passenger, a man she didn't know, gently took the case from her hands and set it on the deck. He said, "Madam, your life is worth more." She stared at him, then at the case. Then she stepped into the lifeboat. The case remained on deck, gleaming under the oil lamps. No one touched it. Later, it would go down with the ship. Lifeboat 7 was lowered at 5:40. 53 people aboard, mostly women and children, a few crewmen to row. The ropes creaked through the pulleys. The boat descended in jerks, swaying. Passengers gripped the sides. When it hit the water, The shock sent a shudder through the hull. The crew released the falls. The boat drifted away from Republic's side, oars splashing awkwardly. The fog swallowed it within seconds. Lifeboat 8 followed, then 9, then 10. The process was slow. Each boat took 15 minutes to load and launch. By 6 in the morning, only half the boats were away. Republic's list had increased to 10 degrees. Walking on deck required holding the rail. Furniture in the public rooms slid towards the starboard wall. In the music room, the Steinway piano broke loose from its restraints and crashed into the windows. Glass shattered. Cold air poured in. The fog smelled of salt and diesel. In the smoking room, a small group of men remained. George Burley among them. His wife was in a lifeboat, already away. He had refused to go with her. So had several others. Colonel Ware, Charles Lightoller, a banker named Edmund Devereux. They sat in the leather chairs, surrounded by books and paneling, and the dying warmth of the gas fireplace. Someone had found a bottle of brandy. They poured glasses. They talked quietly. About business, politics, the absurdity of dying in fog, so close to shore in the modern age. One of them noted that the room still looked immaculate. The velvet curtains, the coffered ceiling, the gold leaf trim. All that craftsmanship, all that money. Going to the bottom. Ware raised his glass and said, "To Republic, a fine ship, a short life." They drank. Below decks, the engineers were fighting. The water in compartment 6 had reached chest height. The firemen had abandoned the stokehold, climbing to safety, but the engineers stayed. They kept the pumps running as long as possible, manually operating valves, rerouting steam, buying time. Chief Engineer William Cotter worked alongside his men, waist deep in freezing water, shouting orders over the noise. The pumps screamed. The pressure was dropping. The boilers were flooding. It was only a matter of time. At 6:20, Cotter gave the order to evacuate the engine room. The men climbed the ladders. Cotter came last. As he reached the top, the lights went out. The pumps stopped. The ship groaned, a deep metallic sound that resonated through every rivet and beam. Below, in the darkness, water continued to rise. On deck, fewer than 200 people remained. Most were men, crew, passengers, a handful of women who had refused to leave husbands or fathers. The lifeboats were gone. The ship was noticeably lower now. The bow was submerged to A deck. Water lapped at the forward staircases. The stern was rising. Standing near the aft rail, you could feel the angle. 15 degrees, maybe 20. Objects began to tumble. Deck chairs slid forward and crashed into railings. A stack of life preservers broke loose and spilled across the deck like leaves. Captain Sealby remained on the bridge. He had sent his final wireless message at 6:30. Republic sinking fast. Boats away. Awaiting rescue. Binns, the wireless operator, stayed at his post, transmitting until the power failed completely. When the key went silent, he sat back and removed his headset. He looked at Sealby. The captain nodded. Binns left the wireless room and went to the boat deck. There were no boats left. He stood at the rail and waited. At 6:50, Baltic's lights appeared on the horizon. Faint, distant, but visible. A cheer went up from the remaining passengers. Help was coming. The question was whether it would arrive in time. Republic was settling faster now. The water had reached B-deck amidships. The list had increased to 25 degrees. The ship was no longer level. She was tilted, leaning into the wound, exposing her port side to the sky. The smokestacks, those twin symbols of power and progress, stood at an angle. The forward stack was nearly horizontal. It looked wrong, unnatural, like seeing a building lean. The men still aboard began tying themselves to railings, to masts, to anything fixed. If the ship went down suddenly, the suction could pull you under. Better to stay attached to something that floated. Debris, wreckage, anything. George Burley tied a rope around his waist and secured it to a ventilation cowling. He cinched it tight. He had survived business panics, market crashes, labor strikes. He had negotiated with governments and outlasted competitors. But he could not negotiate with the Atlantic. The ocean had no board of directors. It did not compromise. Baltic arrived at 7:20. She came alongside slowly, her searchlights cutting through the fog, illuminating Republic's hull. The sight was grim. The ship was visibly sinking. Her bow was submerged past the forecastle. Her stern was high, propellers beginning to emerge from the water. Survivors clung to the upper decks, waving, shouting. Baltic launched her boats, 10 of them. Crews rowed across the gap, carefully, avoiding debris. They reached Republic's side and called for people to climb down. Rope ladders were thrown. Cargo nets deployed. Men descended hand over hand, awkward in their life preservers, fingers numb from cold. George Burley untied his rope and climbed onto the rail. He was 63 years old, overweight, not athletic. The ladder swayed under his weight. He gripped the rope and lowered himself, one rung at a time. His hands slipped. He caught himself. Kept going. Below, a lifeboat waited, rocking in the swell. A crewman reached up. Burley let go and dropped. He landed hard, sprawled across the thwarts, gasping. The crewmen steadied him. They rowed away. By 8 in the morning, everyone who could be rescued had been. Baltic's boats made multiple trips, ferrying survivors from Republic to the liner. 170 men, 43 women, 12 children. Captain Sealby was the last to leave. He descended the ladder at 8:15, stepping into a lifeboat without looking back. Behind him, Republic floated alone, listing heavily, bow submerged, stern rising. She was still afloat, but barely. The water had reached her boat deck. The forward funnel had collapsed, crashing into the sea with a hiss of steam and spray. The lifeboats pulled away. A perimeter formed, 100 yards distant. The survivors watched. Fog still clung to the surface, obscuring details, but the outline was clear. Republic hung there, suspended between floating and sinking, as if the ocean was deciding whether to take her or let her linger. Minutes passed. The ship settled lower. The stern rose higher. The angle increased. 30 degrees. 40. Objects tumbled from the decks. Furniture, luggage, equipment. The sound of things breaking carried across the water. At 8:36, Republic's stern lifted entirely out of the water. Her propellers, massive bronze screws, gleamed wet in the gray light. For a moment, she stood vertical, bow down, stern up, a monument to engineering suspended in impossible defiance. Then she slipped. Smooth, quiet, no explosion, no dramatic plunge. Just a gentle slide into the depths. The water closed over her. A whirlpool formed where she had been, pulling debris inward, swirling, then flattening. Silence returned. The fog rolled back in. The ocean looked as it had before. Empty. Aboard Baltic, survivors stood at the rails, watching the spot where Republic had vanished. Some wept. Others were silent. George Burley stood alone, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, staring at nothing. He had lost his luggage, his papers, his contracts, his wife's jewelry. Everything they had brought was gone. But they were alive. 255 people had been aboard Republic. All had survived. Every single one. It was, by any measure, a miracle. But the story was not over, because Republic had not been carrying only passengers and luggage. In her cargo holds, locked in the ship's safe, secured in compartments that were now 260 feet underwater, was something else. Gold. American Eagle coins. $5 denominations. Freshly minted. Being transported from the U.S. Treasury to banks in Europe as part of normal international monetary transfers. The exact amount was never publicly confirmed. Estimates ranged from $50,000 to $3 million. Some said more. The paperwork was classified. The manifests were sealed. White Star declined to comment. The U.S. government said only that the loss was being assessed. But rumors began immediately. Passengers whispered. Crew members talked. Within days, newspapers were running headlines. Millions in gold, lost with Republic. Treasure ship sinks off Nantucket. The stories grew. Some claimed the gold was payment for arms. Others said it was ransom for a kidnapped diplomat. One account suggested it was Confederate gold, hidden since the Civil War, finally being moved abroad. None of this was substantiated, but the absence of official denial made it plausible. Silence, in the face of specific allegations, is its own kind of confirmation. And so the legend of the Millionaires Ship expanded. It was no longer just a story of survival. It became a story of treasure, of wealth lost, of something valuable lying in the dark, waiting. Salvage companies took note. Investors filed claims. Legal battles began over who owned the wreck, who had rights to recover cargo, or who could profit. The ocean, indifferent, held its secrets. Republic lay on the seabed, intact, her hull resting upright and silt, her hold sealed, her cargo undisturbed. The gold, if it existed, was still there, waiting. The rescue was hailed as extraordinary. 255 souls aboard Republic, and not one lost. The newspapers called it a triumph of modern seamanship, of wireless communication, of discipline and calm. Captain Sealby was praised. Baltic's captain, J.B. Ranson, was praised. The crew of Republic were celebrated for their conduct under pressure. White Star issued statements expressing relief and gratitude. Survivors gave interviews describing the orderly evacuation, the professionalism of the officers, the bravery of men who gave up their lifeboat seats. It was, the public was told, a disaster averted, a close call, a happy ending. But the survivors themselves told a different story. Not publicly, not in interviews, but in letters to family, in private conversations, in diaries that would not surface for decades. They described confusion, panic, crew members who disappeared below decks and never returned. Lifeboats launched half empty, while others were overcrowded to the point of swamping. Stewards who helped first-class passengers retrieve valuables, while third-class passengers drowned in locked compartments. Some of this was exaggeration. Trauma distorts memory. Fear amplifies details. But some of it was true. In third class, the Saiwong toll would have been catastrophic if not for one factor. Republic sank slowly. The collision occurred at 4:47 in the morning. The ship finally went under at 8:36, nearly 4 hours. That gave people time to escape, even from the lower decks, even through locked doors that were eventually broken open by crew or smashed by desperate passengers. But the first 30 minutes were chaos. Families separated in the dark. Children lost in the crush. Water rising in compartments where the only exits were narrow staircases already jammed with bodies. One survivor, a Syrian man traveling with his wife and 3 children, later recounted that he had carried his youngest son on his shoulders, climbing a staircase while water surged around his waist. The stairs were steep. The metal was slick. People ahead of him fell. He climbed over them. His wife was behind him with the other 2 children. He reached the top and turned to help her. She was gone, swept back by the crowd. He shouted her name. No response. He stood there, holding his son, frozen. A steward grabbed him and shoved him towards the boat deck. He never saw his wife or other children again, except he did. They were already in a lifeboat. They had been pushed forward by the surge, exited through a different corridor, and were among the first loaded. The family reunited aboard Baltic, but for 20 minutes he believed they were dead. That kind of terror does not fade. It sits in you. It waits. The wealthiest passengers, by contrast, had time to prepare. George Burleigh had dressed fully. Suit, overcoat, hat. He had packed a small valise with documents, though he eventually abandoned it when told to. Mrs. Hinchcliffe had retrieved her jewelry case, argued about it, then left it behind. Colonel Ware had returned to his cabin twice, once for his coat, once for a photograph of his late daughter. He placed it in his breast pocket. When he was pulled from the water later, clinging to debris after his lifeboat capsized, the photograph was still there, soaked but intact. He kept it for the rest of his life. But the question that haunted many survivors, particularly those in first class, was simpler. Why were we saved and others lost? In fact, no one died, but they did not know that at the time. In the lifeboats, in the fog, separated from the ship, they assumed casualties. They assumed the third-class passengers, the crew in the engine room, the stewards who stayed behind. They assumed those people were gone, and they wrestled with the arithmetic of their own survival. I am alive because I am rich, because I had a cabin on B deck instead of F deck, because a steward helped me first, because I speak English, because I know how to navigate a bureaucracy, even a sinking ship. This guilt, though unspoken, appeared in the letters, in the silences. George Burleigh donated $50,000 to a fund for Republic's crew within a week of returning to New York, an enormous sum. He gave no reason. He simply wrote the check. Mrs. Hinchcliffe endowed a scholarship for the children of merchant seamen. Colonel Ware commissioned a memorial plaque in his hometown, listing the name of every person aboard Republic, survivors, and, though there were none, presumed lost. The plaque still exists. It was an act of remembrance for a disaster that, officially, killed no one. But in the minds of those who lived through it, the dead were there. Potential. Implied. Avoided only by minutes and luck. Then there was Florida, the ship that struck Republic, the ship that caused the disaster. She survived. Barely. When she pulled free from Republic's hull, water poured into her own bow. Her forward compartment flooded. Her captain, Ruspini, ordered full pumps. The crew worked frantically, shoring up bulkheads, sealing leaks. Florida stayed afloat, but she was crippled. She limped toward shore, escorted by a Coast Guard cutter, and eventually made port in New York under tow. She was repaired. She sailed again. No one aboard her died either. But the question of blame became immediate. Who was at fault? Republic had been traveling at 14 knots in thick fog. Florida had been moving slower, but still moving. Both ships had sounded fog signals. Both had lookouts posted. Neither saw the other until seconds before impact. Maritime law in 1909 held that in conditions of low visibility, vessels were required to reduce speed to a point where they could stop within half the visible distance. Neither ship had done this. Both were technically negligent. The inquiries began within days. The United States Board of Trade convened hearings in New York. The Italian government launched its own investigation. Survivors testified. Officers were questioned. Charts were examined. The wireless logs were reviewed. Captain Sealby argued that he had reduced speed and was operating his fog signal properly. Captain Ruspini argued the same. Both men were experienced. Both had clean records. Both believed they had followed procedure. And yet, two ships had collided in open water. The conclusion, unsatisfying to everyone, was that the fog was to blame. That visibility had been so poor, and the conditions so unpredictable, that even prudent captains could not have avoided the collision. Sealby was cleared. Ruspini was cleared. White Star and the Italian shipping line reached a private settlement regarding damages. Republic's insurers paid out claims to passengers for lost luggage. The case was closed. But privately, questions lingered. Why had Republic been traveling at 14 knots in fog? White Star's own regulations recommended reduced speed in such conditions, yet Sealby had maintained near cruising velocity. Was he behind schedule? Under pressure from the company to make port on time? The ship had departed New York an hour late due to a delay in loading cargo. Was Sealby trying to make up time? He never said. In his testimony, he stated only that he believed 14 knots to be safe given the conditions as he understood them. He was mistaken. The collision proved that. But mistake is not the same as negligence. The law agreed. There was also the matter of Florida's navigation. She had no wireless. Her position was determined by dead reckoning. Her charts were outdated. Her crew, while competent, were not trained to the same standard as a White Star officer. She was a cargo ship, not a passenger liner. The standards were different. The expectations were different. Should they have been? If a vessel can sink a ship carrying 255 people, does it matter whether that vessel is a liner or a freighter? The law said yes. Different classes of ships, different rules. But the ocean does not differentiate. Steel is steel. Water is water. And then there was the gold. The rumors intensified after the inquiries concluded. Passengers who had been aboard began to talk more freely. Some claimed they had seen cargo being loaded in New York under armed guard. Others said they had overheard crew members discussing a shipment of valuables. One steward, in an interview years later, stated that he had been told by a superior officer not to enter a certain section of the cargo hold during the voyage. Why? He was not given a reason, just orders. He followed them. White Star's official manifest listed Republic's cargo as mail, textiles, machinery, and general goods. No mention of gold, no mention of currency. But manifests can be incomplete. Valuable cargo was sometimes listed separately, in sealed documents held by the captain and the ship's purser. Those documents went down with Republic. If they existed, they were now on the ocean floor, locked in a safe, inside a ship, under 260 feet of water and silt. Salvage attempts began almost immediately. The first was in 1912, just 3 years after the sinking. A company out of Boston claimed rights to the wreck and sent a diver down. He reached the ship. He reported that she was intact, resting upright, her superstructure largely undamaged. He attempted to enter the hull, but was driven back by strong currents. He surfaced and recommended a more extensive operation with better equipment. The company ran out of money. The effort was abandoned. Other attempts followed in 1922, 1935, 1949. Each time, the technology improved slightly. Divers went deeper, stayed longer, brought back more artifacts. A porthole, a section of railing, a set of china from the first-class dining saloon, still intact, stamped with the White Star logo. These items were sold at auction. Collectors bought them. Museums displayed them. But no one reached the safe. The safe, if the stories were true, was located in the purser's office on sea deck, amidships, behind locked steel doors in a flooded, silt-filled corridor. Accessing it would require cutting through bulkheads, navigating debris, working in near-zero visibility, at a depth where nitrogen narcosis made every decision suspect. It was dangerous, expensive, and possibly pointless if the gold was never there to begin with. But the legend persisted. Treasure hunters are not dissuaded by lack of evidence. They are motivated by it. The absence of proof means the possibility remains. And possibility, however remote, is enough. In the 1960s, a salvage operator named Martin Byerly became obsessed with Republic. He studied the wreck. He researched the cargo manifests. He interviewed descendants of survivors. He became convinced that the ship carried not thousands, but millions of dollars in gold, possibly as much as 7 million, possibly more. Byerly's theory was based on several factors. First, Republic had been carrying a large amount of registered mail, over 200 sacks. Registered mail in that era often contained currency, bonds, and other valuables. Second, the ship had departed New York during a period of financial instability. Banks were transferring assets to Europe to stabilize foreign accounts. Third, and most compellingly, the US. Treasury had never publicly accounted for a shipment of gold coins that was supposed to have arrived in England in early February 1909. The shipment never arrived. Republic sank in late January. The timing matched. Byerly spent decades pursuing the wreck. He obtained salvage rights. He raised money. He assembled a team. In 1987, he led an expedition to the site. Using sonar and remotely operated vehicles, he mapped the wreck in detail. He confirmed that Republic was largely intact. He identified the location of the purser's office. He even attempted to blast through a bulkhead using small explosive charges. The blast succeeded. But it also collapsed part of the corridor, burying the safe under tons of debris. Byerly was forced to withdraw. He vowed to return. He has been trying to return ever since. Other salvagers have made their own attempts. Each time, the ocean resists. Currents shift. Silt clouds the water. Equipment fails. One diver, in 1992, reported seeing the safe. He described it as a large steel box, partially buried, encrusted with rust and marine growth. He attempted to attach a lifting cable. The cable snapped. He ascended. He never went back. Too dangerous, he said. Not worth dying for, even if the gold is there. And that remains the question. Is it there? The evidence is circumstantial. The manifests are incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The government has never confirmed or denied. In 2008, a researcher filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Treasury records related to Republic. The request was denied. The reason given: records related to gold shipments from that period are classified for national security purposes. National security. For a shipment from 1909. The denial raised more questions than it answered. So the wreck remains. Republic lies where she fell, 260 feet below the surface, 45 miles south of Nantucket. The coordinates are known. The site is not protected. Technically, anyone with the resources and the permits can dive it. But the depth, the cold, the currents, they make it one of the most difficult wrecks on the eastern seaboard. Divers who have been there describe it as haunting. The ship is enormous, dark, silent. Fish move through the corridors where passengers once walked. Kelp grows on the railings where Mrs. Hinchcliffe stood, clutching her jewelry case. The grand piano in the music room is gone, rotted away, but the iron frame remains, lying on its side, strings long dissolved. The first-class suites are still identifiable. Doorways, bed frames, the remnants of furniture. In suite B42, George Burley's cabin, a diver found a leather shoe, man's shoe, size 10. Laces still tied. It sat on the silt, perfectly preserved by the cold water, as if someone had just stepped out of it. The diver left it there. Maritime law prohibits removing human remains or personal effects from certain wrecks. Republic, though not officially designated as a grave site, is treated as one by most divers. You can look, you can photograph, but you leave things as you find them. The dining saloon is a cathedral of decay. The glass dome that once let in sunlight is shattered. The columns are still standing. The tables are gone, but their mounting bolts remain, rows of them, marking where hundreds of people once sat and ate and talked and laughed, unaware that in a few days this room would be at the bottom of the sea. On the floor, embedded in silt, are fragments of china, white star pattern, gold rim. You can still see the logo if you brush away the sediment. And somewhere, in the maze of passageways and flooded compartments, behind steel doors that have not been opened in over a century, is the purser's office, and possibly Inside that office, a safe. And possibly, inside that safe, something valuable. Or possibly nothing. Possibly just documents, ledgers, passenger records, the mundane paperwork of a working ship. Possibly the greatest treasure is the mystery itself, the not knowing, the possibility. The story that has been told and retold for over 100 years, each telling adding details, embellishing, mythologizing, until the truth is buried deeper than the wreck. The survivors scattered. Baltic brought them to New York on February 2nd, 1909. They disembarked to crowds of reporters, photographers, concerned relatives. Some gave interviews. Most did not. They collected what compensation White Star offered. Minimal, a few $100s for lost luggage. Passage refunded, and they disappeared back into their lives. George Burleigh returned to his shipping business. Mrs. Hinchcliffe sailed again for England 3 weeks later, on a different ship. Colonel Ware went home to Kansas and never set foot on an ocean liner again. He took trains for the rest of his life. But Republic stayed with them. Survivors reported dreams. Always the same. Darkness, cold water, the sound of metal tearing. Some heard the collision in ordinary sounds. A door slamming, a car backfiring. Anything sudden and loud sent them back to that moment at 4:47 in the morning, when their world inverted. Psychologists had no name for this yet. Shell shock would be identified during the First World War, 5 years later. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be formally recognized until the 1980s, but the symptoms were the same: hypervigilance, insomnia, a pervasive sense that safety was temporary, that disaster could arrive without warning, that the structures meant to protect you, steel hulls, watertight compartments, experienced captains, were illusions. Some survivors became obsessed with the wreck. They followed every salvage attempt. They contacted treasure hunters, offering information, sometimes funding. A businessman named Edwin Farwell, who had been traveling first class with his wife, spent thousands of dollars hiring researchers to comb through treasury records, shipping logs, customs documents. He was convinced the gold existed. He wanted proof. He never found it. But he kept looking until he died in 1941. His widow donated his files to a maritime museum. They fill 3 archive boxes: notes, diagrams, correspondence with government officials who politely declined to comment. At the bottom of the 3rd box is a single photograph. Republic at dock in New York, her white hull gleaming, passengers boarding. On the back, in Farwell's handwriting, "She was beautiful. We trusted her." That trust, misplaced or not, was central to the experience of traveling first class in the Edwardian era. You paid for certainty. The ticket cost $300, 6 months' wages for a laborer. And what you purchased was not just a cabin and meals, but the assurance that you were insulated from risk. The ship was modern. The crew was trained. The company was reputable. White Star had been operating transatlantic service for decades. They knew what they were doing. And yet Republic sank. Not from a storm, not from an iceberg, from another ship, in calm seas, in fog, because 2 captains made assumptions that proved incorrect. The randomness of it was unbearable. At least a storm has grandeur. Fog is just absence. The company's response was carefully managed. White Star issued statements emphasizing the successful rescue. They praised Captain Sealby. They noted that the ship had been equipped with wireless, that the distress call had been answered, that every life had been saved. This, they argued, demonstrated the effectiveness of modern safety measures. The implication was clear. The system worked. Yes, the ship sank. But the people did not. And people, not ships, were what mattered. Privately, White Star was more concerned. Republic had been insured, but the payout did not cover her full value. The cargo claims were modest, officially, but there were rumors of lawsuits being prepared. Passengers alleging negligence, crew members seeking compensation for lost wages and personal effects. The company settled most of these quietly, out of court, with non-disclosure agreements attached. The amounts were not made public, but the legal files, later unsealed, show payments ranging from $500 to $15,000, depending on the claimant's resources and persistence. The wealthy, predictably, received more. Then there was the matter of reputation. Republic's sinking came just 3 years before Titanic. When Titanic went down in April 1912, the comparisons were immediate. Both White Star ships. Both sank after collisions. Both were considered unsinkable. The difference, of course, was that Titanic's death toll was catastrophic, over 1,500 lost, while Republic's was 0. White Star emphasized this in their public relations. They pointed to Republic as proof that their safety protocols, particularly the use of wireless, were effective. The tragedy was not the sinking. The tragedy would have been the loss of life. And there was none. But this narrative required ignoring certain facts. Republic sank in 4 hours. Titanic sank in 2 hours 40 minutes. Republic sank in relatively shallow water, close to other ships. Titanic sank in the middle of the Atlantic, hours from help. Republic sank in fog, but calm seas. Titanic sank in clear weather, but freezing water filled with ice. The circumstances were not comparable. Republic's survival rate was as much luck as design. Had the collision occurred at night in a storm, or farther from shore, or if Baltic had been even an hour farther away, the outcome would have been different. White Star knew this, but they did not say it. What they also did not say, publicly, was how close Republic had come to capsizing. The ship listed heavily to starboard after the collision, 25 degrees at its worst. Most ships become unstable past 30 degrees. Beyond that, they roll. Survivors in the lifeboats reported that Republic seemed to hesitate before sinking. She hung at an angle, bow submerged, stern high, as if deciding. Engineers later speculated that water flooding the portside compartments may have counterbalanced the starboard damage, preventing a complete rollover. Or perhaps the air trapped in sealed compartments provided just enough buoyancy to keep her upright. Or perhaps it was simply chance. Ships, like people, die in specific ways. Republic's death was slow, tilted, but ultimately controlled. She did not break apart. She did not explode. She slipped under, almost gently. Others were not so fortunate. Among the crew, the sinking became a reference point. Sailors who had served on Republic carried the experience with them to other ships. They were careful. Some became obsessive about safety drills. Others refused to sail in fog. A steward named Albert Harwell, who had helped load lifeboats that morning, transferred to land-based work within a year. He took a job as a hotel porter in Boston. A significant pay cut, but he never went to sea again. In an interview decades later, he said, "I saw what water can do. I don't need to see it twice." The engineers were haunted differently. Chief Engineer William Cotter, who had stayed in the flooding engine room until the last possible moment, was hailed as a hero. He received commendations, job offers, but he struggled. He began drinking. His marriage deteriorated. In 1913, he was found dead in his apartment in Liverpool. The coroner ruled it a suicide. He had left a note, brief. "The ship is still sinking." His colleagues understood. You can leave a wreck, but the wreck does not leave you. By the 1920s, Republic had faded from public memory. Titanic's sinking overshadowed it. Then came the First World War, the Spanish flu, the Depression. The world moved on. But in certain circles, salvagers, historians, treasure hunters, the story persisted. And it changed. Details were added, embellished. The amount of gold grew with each telling. 50,000 became 500,000, became 5 million. Some accounts claimed the ship was carrying Tsarist gold. smuggled out of Russia before the revolution. Others said it was Confederate gold, or Aztec gold, or gold looted from the Vatican. None of this was true. But the lack of official denial made it plausible. The most persistent rumor involved J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not aboard Republic. He rarely traveled in winter, but he was a major shareholder in International Mercantile Marine, which owned White Star. Some versions of the story claimed Morgan had arranged for a secret shipment of gold to be placed aboard Republic as part of a scheme to manipulate European currency markets. When the ship sank, the gold was lost, and Morgan faced financial ruin. To cover this, he suppressed the manifests and paid off investigators. The story had drama. It had villains. It had conspiracy. It also had no evidence. Morgan's finances were scrutinized constantly during his lifetime. No record of such a scheme exists. But absence of evidence to believers is not evidence of absence. In 1967, a journalist named Robert Holt published a book titled The $1 Million Wreck. It focused on Republic and the salvage attempts. Holt interviewed Byerly, reviewed the historical records, and concluded that while the exact amount was unknowable, it was likely that Republic carried some gold. How much? He estimated between $1 and $3 million, based on treasury shipping patterns and insurance claims filed by European banks. The book was popular. It inspired a new wave of interest. More salvagers, more expeditions, more failures. One attempt in 1973 came close. A team using newly developed saturation diving techniques managed to cut into the purser's office. They reported finding the safe. It was massive. 4 feet tall, steel, bolted to the floor. They attempted to open it underwater using hydraulic tools. The tools failed. They tried explosives. Small charges, carefully placed. The blast shook the wreck. Debris filled the corridor. When the silt settled, the safe was still closed. Worse, the blast had destabilized part of the deck above. The divers were forced to evacuate. One suffered decompression sickness on the ascent. He survived, but lost partial function in his left arm. The expedition was abandoned. The safe remains sealed. Other divers reported strange occurrences, equipment malfunctions, cameras failing at specific locations, air hoses snagging on invisible obstacles. One diver, in 1981, claimed he saw a figure in one of the first-class corridors. A woman in a long dress, standing in a doorway. He approached. She vanished. He surfaced immediately and refused to dive the wreck again. Skeptics noted that nitrogen narcosis at depth can cause hallucinations. Stress, cold, and low visibility contribute. The mind fills gaps. It creates patterns where none exist. But the diver was experienced. He had logged over 200 dives. He knew the symptoms of narcosis. This, he said, was different. Republic over the decades has become more than a wreck. It has become a myth, a story people tell to illustrate greed, hubris, the limits of technology, the indifference of the sea. It serves different purposes for different audiences. For treasure hunters, it is the ultimate prize. For historians, it is a case study in maritime disaster. For descendants of survivors, it is family lore. For divers, it is a challenge. And for the ocean, it is simply debris, steel and wood and bone, slowly dissolving, returning to the elements from which they came. The wreck site itself is changing. Surveys conducted in the 2000s show that Republic is deteriorating faster than expected. The hull is collapsing in sections. The superstructure, once largely intact, is fragmenting. Currents have scoured away parts of the deck. Marine life has colonized the interior. Mussels, barnacles, anemones. In another 50 years, the ship may be unrecognizable. In 100, it may be gone entirely, dissolved into the sediment, leaving only a scatter of artifacts and rust stains on the seafloor. And the gold, if it exists, will remain. Gold does not corrode. It does not decay. A coin minted in 1908 looks the same in 2024. If Republic carried millions in gold eagles, they are still there, still gleaming, still valuable. Assuming anyone can reach them. Assuming the safe can be opened. Assuming the legend is more than just a story, but perhaps the gold is irrelevant. Perhaps the true treasure is what Republic represents. The Edwardian belief that wealth could insulate you from danger, that luxury equaled security, that the world could be controlled through engineering and capital. Republic's passengers believed this. They paid for it. And when the ship went down, that belief went with it. The millionaires survived, but their certainty did not. There is a photograph taken in 1908 of Republic docked in New York. The ship is pristine. White hull, polished brass, flags flying. On the dock, a crowd has gathered. Top hats, long skirts, the fashion of the era. Some are boarding. Others are saying goodbye. Everyone looks confident, prosperous, secure. The photograph is titled, in faded ink on the back, Republic, Queen of the Atlantic. She was not a queen. She was a ship. And ships sink. In the end, Republic's story is not about treasure. It is about mortality. The millionaires who sailed on her thought they had transcended risk. They had money, status, first-class tickets. They dined on fine china and slept in mahogany suites and assumed that these things mattered. And then, in the dark, in the fog, another ship appeared. And all that luxury became irrelevant. The ocean does not recognize wealth. It does not grant exceptions. It takes what it wants, when it wants, and it offers no explanations. George Burleigh understood this. After Republic, he became quieter, less certain. He still ran his business, still made deals, still accumulated wealth. But he never sailed again. He took trains, even to Europe, trains to Halifax, then trains across Canada, then trains across Russia, then trains to his destination. It took weeks, but it avoided the ocean. When asked why, he said only, "I learned my limits." Mrs. Hinchcliffe did sail again, but she never enjoyed it. She traveled out of necessity, not pleasure. She kept to her cabin. She did not dine in the saloon. She did not socialize. On one crossing, a steward knocked on her door to invite her to the captain's table. She declined. He persisted. She opened the door and said, "Young man, I have been on the ocean floor once. I have no desire to return." He did not ask again. The last survivor of Republic died in 1987. Her name was Dorothy Gibson. She had been 6 years old when the ship sank, traveling with her parents in second class. She remembered very little. The noise, the cold, being wrapped in a blanket in a lifeboat. But she remembered her father's face, the fear in it. She said he never looked at her the same way again, as if he had seen something in her that frightened him, as if surviving had marked her. Gibson lived to be 84. She gave occasional interviews about Republic, though she disliked doing so. People, she said, always wanted to hear about the gold. They wanted treasure, drama. She had none to offer. Her family had not been wealthy. They had lost nothing of monetary value. Just safety, just certainty, just the belief that the world was predictable. That, she said, was worth more than gold, and harder to recover. Republic remains where she fell, 45 miles south of Nantucket, 260 feet down. The coordinates are public: 40 degrees, 26 minutes north, 69 degrees, 46 minutes west. You can visit if you have the equipment and the skill and the willingness to risk your life for a glimpse of history. Most people do not. They read the stories. They wonder about the gold. They imagine what it would be like to find it. But imagination costs nothing. Diving costs everything. The legend endures because people need it to. We want to believe that somewhere, Hidden, there is wealth waiting to be discovered. That risk can be rewarded. That loss can be recovered. Republic offers that hope. A ship full of millionaires, sunk with treasure aboard, waiting in the dark. It is a perfect story. Too perfect, perhaps. Perfect enough to ignore the truth that most treasure is imaginary, most wrecks are empty, and most stories end not with fortune, but with silence. Still, the divers keep coming. The salvagers keep planning. The researchers keep filing requests for classified documents. And the ocean keeps its secrets. Republic lies on the bottom, slowly dissolving, slowly forgetting what it once was. The millionaires are long dead. The gold, if it ever existed, remains untouched. And the story grows, year by year, becoming less history and more myth. Until one day, perhaps, someone will succeed. They will open the safe. They will find the gold. Or they will find nothing. And either way, the story will end. But not yet. For now, Republic waits, in the cold, in the dark, still sinking in a way, still carrying her secrets, still refusing to give them up. The Millionaires Ship, the treasure ship, the ghost ship, all of these, none of these, just steel and memory, resting where the ocean placed it, beyond reach, beyond certainty, beyond redemption.